Hey Eric, how are you?
Hi, how are you doing?
Very
Um,
good,
it's,
thanks.
um, am I saying it right? Wojciech? Is that
Yes, that's
can you,
perfect.
okay. Um, uh,
Perfect for an English speaking person. Like if you were Polish, you'd say it differently, but I'm not trying to like I would never do that to an speaking person. Same as let's say I worked in London, right? So I
yep.
always myself butchered the people. I worked through with people from all over the world, and I'm sure I would always butcher the name, and so I guess having that experience myself, what you said is just perfect for me.
Can I hear you say it though?
So actually, my name is my friends would call me Wojtek.
Wojciech. Okay.
Yeah, but then Wojciech
Yep.
with a at the end is the formal name, and that's what I have on my LinkedIn, and that's what people started calling me. Like guys in
Ah,
my business call me Wojciech. They
okay.
actually call me Wojciech, like you did.
Okay. Okay. All right.
So
Okay.
yeah, but thanks for asking. That's
Um,
always cool to.
I do know the feeling. My last name's Beland. Well, it's in French, it would be Beland, but no one in the United States is going to really say that. So Eric Beland here,
Mm.
and
So you got
um,
French roots or just French
uh,
name?
French roots and French name, but I've got a lot of other roots too. That just happened to be the one that made it into the last name.
Okay,
Um,
got it.
so.
So,
Um,
for those of you who don't know you, Eric, if you could tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. Let's see. I'm the founder of BrowserUp. BrowserUp is a load testing company that lets you reuse the things you have for load testing. So it's kind of the first dry automation tool. Before that, I worked in the load testing industry, but also I was a manager at Constant Contact on their email editor. So that's a little bit of my history.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, so actually, I was curious about that experience you had there. So, what would you say would be the top three challenges scaling that type of software, email marketing software? I'm guessing from a performance points of view, or maybe not even that, just generally.
Yeah. So I guess starting off with like just so I was before I was a manager, I was a developer on the product. And I did a lot of the back end engineering and with just a couple other people here and there. And so the biggest challenge was I would say caching. So basically, if you want to deliver a highly performant solution that scales, it really is tricky when there's a lot of personalization involved. And so like caching and cache invalidation, I would say are actually probably the trickiest parts,
Mm,
to because you can, caching is like kind of like I don't want to say smoke and mirrors, but a little bit of programming because it lets you cheat on performance in a lot of ways. Like you can have something really expensive, and if you hit it just right and like you only load it the time you need it, and and also maybe you preload it ideally so that the first person doesn't have to suffer through whatever the long call is either. You could do a lot of interesting things, but it's definitely like an art. So I would say that's like
mm,
probably the number one. Constant Contact worked at really high volumes. So like, they're
mm.
not necessarily always from the email editor backend, but other parts of the system are especially taxing. Like the thing that sends the email is probably the most taxing, but I didn't luckily have to deal with that part.
Mm.
So
So caching and cache invalidation, it actually reminds me of, I don't remember who said this, but it was like the quote goes something like the two most um, hard things in software development are cache invalidation and naming things. So you
yeah,
kind of got caught up in one of those.
yeah, and it's interesting because sometimes the cache invalidation it actually goes to naming in a sense. It's not so much the naming like in a programmatic sense, like naming a class. It's more like the address scheme naming. So it ends up
Mm,
being a little bit of both, like naming something that or positioning it in the addressing scheme such that it gets loaded only when it needs to,
mm,
and cached. And kind of broken out in a way where it just gets cached and used when it needs to. So yeah, I would say that was like the very trickiest part,
got it.
for sure. Um,
So having experienced a lot of these performance-focused projects or large-scale projects, what would you see are the typical challenges performance testing teams would face today?
So there's a couple different ones. So one would be that for a lot of the performance testing stuff, it's kind of instantly stale. And what I mean is there's for HTTP level tests, there's a lot of times you'll use like a recording tool, or you'll do something to kind of capture. And so if you have a person like we had. We call them quality engineers, but it could be SDETs or different roles. But if you have someone who goes through and does that, the moment they've done it, if the developer then checks in anything else that changes the pattern of the load, it's now actually stale. So as an industry, kind of we get by on that, but or have historically. But that's like one of the kind of chief problems. I can give an example. So this actually relates to the caching issue we were just talking about, or the caching challenges. We added a personalized footer at Constant Contact while I was there. And so if you load the web page editor, at the bottom, there's a footer there that's like, it's the thing that unsubscribe, that sort of thing. But you could customize it and so forth. And so basically, because it's a long story, but we started including that in the editor. And what happened was it wasn't communicated clearly to the folks doing the performance. And we had these snapshotted, captured load tests that were running in our CI/CD system that were telling us everything's awesome. But those were essentially a snapshot or a recording from when that request wasn't there. And actually, related to caching, this thing was not properly cached and was abysmally slow, like 2 seconds just to load that one part of the request, which was our entire budget for the performance. So because there's no browser involved and it's just a snapshot, basically, like, we went out and we released this on the world, and then we were like, well, we tested it. Why is the performance slow? And it was a false positive. And so that's one of the problems that I kind of tried to tackle with BrowserUp, which is just we give you the ability to kind of run real browser tests, which are not so susceptible to this. They would have just loaded the footer as a matter of loading the page. So they're not these kind of stale snapshots. They're more fluid. So that's one of the things that I was trying to solve with BrowserUp, was basically just
if you could tell us a bit more about BrowserUp. What is BrowserUp?
So BrowserUp does it. So just to clarify, there is such a thing as real browser testing tools now, but this does an intersection of a couple interesting things with a different approach that, and one of the things it does well is real browser, but BrowserUp actually uses a containerized scaling model. So what I mean by that is, under the hood, what we do is basically take a thing that is executable, kind of like, like if you typed a command in the terminal into bash prompt, like something you're running something, right? And we take that thing that you're kind of pointing to and a command, and we put it into a container where all the traffic gets captured. And we scale those containers so that, so you could have 1,000, 5,000 things running that container. So those things that execute could be browsers inside the container. They could be a call that launches your REST API client and puts it through some paces. It could be a binary executable. It doesn't matter too much what it is to us, actually. So it's the first, and so what the most common use case is kind of solves the other problem, right? So putting this into, say, CI/CD for a load test. The first barrier is, as I mentioned, it's kind of stale in a lot of cases. The second barrier is that you're usually not working in the same tool as the other tests you have and in the same language. Most of the time, it's going to force you into a specific other tool to kind of like script a load test in some of the tools, or the recording things I just mentioned. We do something entirely different, which is we use we call it the first dry load testing tool. So don't repeat yourself. We actually use what you use for functional tests for the load test. So you're ready like a whole bunch earlier in the cycle, in the release cycle. They call it kind of in testing shift left. I don't know if you've heard this term running around,
Yeah,
but
100%. Yeah.
yeah. So this is so usually it load testing historically has not shifted left well. It's been kind of the stickiest thing because someone comes in the separate tool after everything's fully baked, and they make a new set of scripts. And so you have these two implementations of how to talk to your app. You have the one you did at the kind of functional and testing stage early on, and then later you do another one in this other separate tool. It could be JMeter, could be like
Load Runner. There's a bunch of those tools,
exactly.
right?
There's a ton of them. Yeah, exactly. And so the difference for us is we reuse the same thing. So you can basically just put it in your CI/CD, and as soon as you're done with the first implementation, you're basically done, because that's actually what we run for the test. And so
that makes sense. So you're basically you're creating performance tests or a performance suite of tests by reusing the functional tests.
exactly.
And you
And so
provide the technology for that.
exactly. And so it's interesting too. The functional tests might be could be Playwright, Selenium, could be any language, could also be Postman. So it's really what all these other assets you already maintain that know how to talk to your app. You can just use those for the test.
Got it. So how do you typically handle things like, let's say I'm working with my clients, and what they see is these issues where their functional tests would sometimes burn the test data,
Yeah.
or the test data is not there, so you'd have to set it up and then potentially reset it. So I'm guessing when you run 10 BrowserUp containers, the test data you're gonna burn through the test data even faster.
Yep. So a couple of things that we would recommend, and this comes partly from my history with load testing and stuff like that. So first off, yes, that's the data management is a real challenge on some of these apps, right? So first off, that's a totally useful and valid question, and I know I'm guessing we can talk about how Traffic Parrot can help with that.
I'm genuinely interested in your experience, right? Like I'm not trying to sell here anything like that. I'm just generally interested.
Well, and to be clear, I'm generally intrigued in general by like the things that something like Traffic Parrot could open up. But what I normally would recommend, for a while I did load test consulting. I actually went around the world to like giant companies and did their load tests and helped them with their load tests. The best thing is actually a circular script if you can do it. So basically, like if I certain things, you can create the thing that you're going to use and then destroy it when you're done. So that can be a very good strategy. You can also kind of run the create script once, and then on your subsequent loops, you don't. And so you can create it, work with it, and then at the end, you can destroy. And so generally, I would say the first pattern is to prefer, where possible, circular scripts or scripts that don't burn or overly create data. So that's the first strategy. But there's a bunch of other strategies too, like seeding and then destroying if it's a test environment you have control over, that sort of thing. The nice thing on the circular approach is you could run it in any environment and not be like as terrified that you're going to accidentally create a ton of records, but there's always a risk. You have to make sure it's not erroring and that sort of thing. And so that there is an element of risk that you can have some like dangling data because you run partway through it and it starts failing before the delete step. And a solution for that is to make, if you have a delete step that you can call kind of independently, and just kind of not have it be dependent on the rest of it. So there's for example, since we do it in code, you could use a catch and catch the catch the error that it didn't finish the normal playthrough and then force the delete at the end. So.
Got it. And how would you typically recommend setting up the test data in, I don't know, it's a hard question, but I'm kind of going back to the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago about mainframes. So what would be your recommendation there? So we got this mainframe and it's like managed by a team that's working on yearly schedules. And, if you want to set up test data there, it's just, they tell you, no problem at all, just it's going to be ready in 3 months.
Okay.
And you want to, let's say you want to redo your performance tests because you're running BrowserUp. You want to be able to run your performance test in CI/CD, which is continuously, right? So you can't actually wait for 3 months for the test data. You want to be able to have it like on the spot.
I guess it depends. I'm curious on the particulars, right? So is this a bunch of pre-existing like production data? Like what is the? I guess it depends on the strategy depends on the data and the type of app and the scenario in which you're running it.
Yeah, so I can pick one of. So I'm just speaking from experience from different customers. There's like different customers, and we could pick one of those mainframe groups, let's say. So one of them would be for regulatory reasons. Sometimes they need to test with production-like data that has been what's the word? Scramble desanitized, right? So basically there's no real users there, but it has to be production-like data and some part of the performance test. So that would have like, different component performance tests. But then once they test everything together for a couple of smoke tests, they choose to, for whatever reason, one of the explanations is regulatory guidelines. But, I guess we could debate that how well of an implementation of those rules is a full performance test. But leaving that aside, let's say we've got this situation. What would you say?
Okay. So I guess the first thing I would wonder about is can you take that scrub data set, export it and reuse it and basically spin up, and I don't know. So the word mainframe, I always think that means like there's no cloud and you can't spin one up. So maybe that is the case. I don't know. But
yeah, so yeah, that's a very good question actually. So you can spin it up. It's just 150 grand, right? For the smallest environments. Well, you got to buy that server and you got to wait for 6 to 12 months before it gets installed, wherever it's installed.
Okay, that almost reminds me of, so I've been actually doing in the load testing world for like, I don't know, probably like 20 years. I don't like to count it. It depresses me out about how old I'm getting. But back then, getting the servers to do load testing, this is kind of where the HTTP kind of super thin client came in, because you just couldn't get a server on a short-term basis that could do a full load test. So you had to come up with something that was like highly efficient and didn't run real browsers, because like you would have to rent it in a data center for a month. You'd have to buy the server because or minimally you were looking at a month for each server you need, even though you might only need them for a couple hours, right? So like so that's kind of like where the load testing world we're in now kind of evolved out of. It's just that it's gotten harder to do like WebSockets, all these other like complexities and microservices, authorization. So it's interesting because the mainframe kind of thing is kind of like a callback to that era where you just like, you don't have the option to just instantly spin one up. The cloud isn't the,
Yeah, totally. So, you mentioned microservices. So the clients I have in mind right now in this particular bucket, right? There's other buckets, but in this particular bucket, they actually do microservices, but on top of that, right? But they still, unfortunately, have to interface with those old systems, for example, to the payments, international payments, etc. Right? They still haven't book flights. They still haven't got out of that technology in those areas.
Yep. So in that case, to be honest, like honestly, the ideal is probably something like mocking that data, right? Like if you can mock. So, and this is actually, so this also calls back to your other question about what was the greatest challenges. So one of the problems we had with our testing, and I'm curious actually, and I legitimately want to know, this is not a commercial.
Okay. I'm curious now, what is the question?
If traffic pair can do this. So what we used to have all the time is we would get failures running our test suite. Not so much actually for load, although it could be there, but because these other services were down. And to be honest, something that could parrot the data, if you will, would have been a really nice solution there, because if the authentication system was down, we were working on the back end for the email editor. We didn't necessarily care, we care, but this is on a back end test system, right? So it can be down, but what's happening is they've released something new as an example, and yeah, it brought the server down, and so now the service doesn't answer. That microservice is dead, even though it's going to be working, tomorrow. They're just doing what everyone does, which is make a mistake here and there, right? We did them too. But what would happen is we'd have, I don't know, there's probably say 10 or 15 of those services, right? And if you just do the math on like, what are the odds someone has pushed something which doesn't work, that it got to be actually reasonably high. And so we would have these test failures where it's like, oh, can we get a great test run right now? Like, what, has no one broken anything? Because at this moment, and then that would be okay. We can move the code around and move it up into our higher end production environments. So I'm curious if Traffic Parrot could answer something like that, or if that's on your roadmap, or if that's something you do now. I'm curious, because it was definitely a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting you asked the question. Where I've got a call tomorrow with a company we've been working for the past 2 months, helping them with exactly that problem. And this is, we've got, let's say, 3 or 4 buckets of typical problems customers come to us with, and this would be one of them, exactly. And there's several ways, depending, going back to your follow-up questions, you need to ask some follow-up questions to know more about the details of the situation and how the constraints are distributed, how the teams work, what's the downtime like, what's the reason for the downtime, what kind of protocols are involved. After I ask those kinds of questions, I will be able to recommend a solution. But there's a few categories, right? So the first one, and probably the simplest one, is you record the traffic between your system and the dependencies, be it one or several. And whenever the dependency is not available, you automatically switch to the real services. So we've got, actually, I'm thinking about a client right now in Australia. There's like a bank in Australia, and they're doing that. So you've got Traffic Parrot that's returning things from the mocks, and then it's when the real service is down, and when the real service up, is just proxying things to the real service. Another variation of that could be, for example, which that bank is doing actually as well. They've got certain mocks, or simulators as they call them, that would have specific test data in the virtual service or the mock or the simulator. So let's say if I get accounts for user Eric, that's, everybody knows that's going to come always from the mock. But then any other users will be coming back from the real backend systems, right? So that allows you to segregate the tests that way if you wanted to. That's probably one of the simpler things to start with, though it comes with challenges, like you need to know that's in your infrastructure. And if you've got a complex test environment, everybody needs to know that actually that stuff's either coming from the real system or from the mocks. And because that has implications on your tests, right? So your tests might be failing for different reasons, right? And depending on how your tests are designed, you might have tests that are testing your system under test and only fail for the reasons that are embedded in the system under test. And sometimes the tests are kind of not assuming what the other systems do, but they actually rely on, let's say, a payment being made, right? Which is actually your dependent system. So if you're relying on that and it comes back from a mock, and mock does something else than the real system, suddenly your test fails and you don't know, wow, the mainframe's not working, but it's actually a mock, right? So that's the trade-off you have here, right, in this option. then there's a few other things you could do. So we've got a client. The client we're working with right now actually is going to introduce the one I've mentioned earlier is going to be introducing a separate mocking environment, which you can trigger by sending a header, a specific header in the request. And what that allows you to do is have simpler mocks. They don't have to be like stateful. They don't have to be very dynamic, and they're just going to be easy to write and maintain. And you can easily switch to that environment, but it's in the client's control. It's not the mocks that control that behavior and understand is the system down or not. That's one thing that's actually quite hard sometimes to understand, because it's easy to say if something returns a 500 error, you can say, all right, it's actually down. Whereas sometimes it's got intermittent failures, etc. So it's a bit harder to say if it's down or not actually. Okay. So then if you put it on the user side, let's say, and use a header to direct between those two environments, that's going towards a bit more complicated test environment, but giving the users, which is the developers and testers, more control over how they want to do their development and testing.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you can create those mocks by creating them manually or doing a recording. So we've got another client where we're working with them right now. That's another Fortune 600 company, and I've actually got a call with them later today. So what we're doing for them is, and they've got a group of microservices running in a test environment, and what they would like to do is sometimes that the dependencies, when they're not available, they would like to be able to start testing locally. So forget about the environment. We would like to actually be able to develop and test just this one microservice locally.
Okay.
So what we do is plug in the mocks recordings to their environment between each of the microservices automatically. The recordings are made there, and then you can just click a button in the CI/CD pipeline for the latest run, download the latest recordings, run a script locally, and it spins up the environment locally with the mocks, right? Okay. So there's I could talk about other ones, but it's already probably a long answer to your question here, right?
That last one you just described is actually pretty close to something that could handle it might even be the thing that would handle it. Because if you spun up the mocked environments and ran against those, maybe we try against the real thing. If it doesn't work, spin up something like that and then run the tests, and it passes, then okay, like it's not me, it's you. Which was actually one of the things that we were always trying to answer, like who's really broken here, and if the mock represented how it was and we're fine with how it was, then but not how it is, then we know which service it is. So that's kind of interesting.
That makes sense. So I think what I would ask typically in that scenario would be, what did your test rely on? Does it rely on the functionality of that external system? And do you want it to rely on that functionality, right?
Yeah, and it did. And it's interesting. There's value in both, right? So like, knowing that that the API hasn't changed and that you still work with the current version and that there's no problems with that, and the two integrate is valuable. But also knowing that that it's all, there's actually several areas of value, right? Like knowing that you work with what it was is valuable. Knowing that it changed is valuable. And knowing that it's down and it's not your fault is also valuable. So it's like a series of things. I think they each have some value. So it makes me wonder, like, I guess if you run the test that actually talks to it and it passes, then that's maybe like the most reassuring. But there's still data that you want, which is like, okay, well, why, who screwed up, and so there's like, you could stage it almost. If you get to the if you kill the end boss and talk to the actual service and it's good, then great, you don't need anything else. But if it fails, then there's all those other items which you get really interesting data from.
Yeah. And I'm guessing what you would do in those cases is just run different types of tests, or
Yeah, so that actually, to be honest, that's when the diagnosis would start, right? Like, so go look at the failure. Okay, what's coming back? You know, we had folks who would look at that and could, you know, piece it together. And we would keep the data in CI/CD system, and you could look and see like what the log was saying and what the record, you know, what you know, hopefully it's at dumping out the error of what the response was, and you can look and say, oh, okay, all right, well, it's got this extra field or this or that, or, you know, maybe the error says that, and then that's helpful. But if you could know that without having to dig in, it would speed things. You know,
I see. All right. So you'd like to kind of shorten the debugging time and just slice it up in the middle and say, is it your fault or our fault? Because half of the time, or whatever is the percentage in your experience, it was somebody else's fault, and then the debugging time is wasted. Yeah, I mean, in that case, if you have not too complex services, and by that I mean, let's say that there's a complex service where, let's say, going back to one of the clients, when you've got literally 100 endpoints and the state gets carried by a lot of them, that's something complex to mock, right? And if you wanted to replicate that behavior in a mocking environment, that's going to be quite hard. And then you've got this authorization example you've mentioned. That's typically pretty straightforward. You pass in your credentials, you get back an authorization token or something like that, right? So two ends of the spectrum. If this one goes down often and it causes your tests to fail, then yeah, it's like a no-brainer to mock or simulate. Out of curiosity, do you remember what was the technology they used there for the authorization? Was it like JOTS, or was it OAuth, or?
It changed a couple times. I think last at the end, I feel like we ended up with like Okta, and under the hood, that's I think that's it's a kind of like oh wait, well, we actually had a
Never mind. I was just curious, you know.
Yeah, so we had long story short is there's a couple variants. We had for the test that you could run if you were behind the firewall. We had another authentication thing where it's like, so
I see. Yeah.
the tests wouldn't actually be running that way. And yeah, so that's the rough. The answer is maybe it's complicated or something like that. I guess it depends on the exact question, but yeah.
So going back to BrowserUp, what would be let's say the three problems engineering managers would face today that should make them think about BrowserUp or trigger them to reach out to you?
Yeah. All right. So a couple things. One is if you want to release sooner, if you're load testing, like there's certain kind of like industries and groups that tend to load test heavily. You know, like banking, financials in general, insurance, travel. Some of these industries probably that actually do have like the older mainframes here and there too. So there's some overlap because it tends to be, you know, larger industries that if it existed at scale. I mean, everyone can and should load test, but there's folks who invest more into it and do it more often with every release, and you know, someone's neck is on the line if you know, if there's a failure and they didn't check out load testing. So yeah, so for those folks, if they're doing this regularly, in our surveys, what we see is that it's usually cost people somewhere between around, the typical is 2 to 4 weeks, with 2 being probably the most typical answer to get. So load testing will happen a lot of times delayed a sprint or a couple weeks after everything is baked, kind of thing. And then it will take a while before your go to release. So if you want to release 2 weeks sooner, if you're in that bucket that load test regularly, that's one of the ways that we deliver value. That's difficult to do. in any other manner, because we can reuse the stuff you have really early in the test cycle to run those tests, and you can get that feedback right away. So if you want to shift left, that's what this is for. And so that would be kind of the first thing, is if you're looking to release earlier, if you want to do it with less labor hours invested, that's another element of it, right? That person is usually highly technical who's doing those things, and there's probably a lot of other things they could be doing that would help you. So that's another element of it. So I would say that's the maybe the first kind of thing. The next thing is, if you're not, let's see, if you have an app that's in a language other than JavaScript, the only code-based tools tend to be, there's like mostly JavaScript, and there's a couple that are off the beaten path that you could use, but we really fit a place if you're multilingual, and you want to have your developers do the load testing, because we're not working at a level where we have to care what the language that drives the test is, because we containerize everything. We kind of sit back from that, and so that's another great fit, right? So if you want to, for example, if you've got a Ruby on Rails app and you want to write your tests and your functional tests in Ruby, or you already have them, you can kind of reuse them to do this. Whereas there isn't a great fit for that otherwise. You'd have to work in a separate language and tool, and that usually means you're doing it later. So basically, if you want to shift left by doing things earlier, that's the primary driver. We have a bunch of other things that we kind of make easier: WebSockets, all sorts of things like talking to REST APIs, and reusing stuff in that regard. But I would say the biggest thing is if you're looking to shift your load testing left and get that feedback earlier, that's our kind of sweet spot, and release sooner because of that.
Sounds good. Awesome. So managers that have a KPI or OKR, key result, associated with performance risk, downtimes due to performance, and they would like to test more often or shift left their performance testing as a solution, talk to Eric or somebody at BrowserUp. Awesome. Yeah. So what kind of return on investment you would expect to see after adopting BrowserUp?
So I mean, I guess there's really two ways to measure that. It's, what's the return on releasing each cycle of your software 2 weeks earlier, and that's going to vary by company. But I certainly think there's a lot of product folks who would be interested in that number. So that would be like the first area of return, and then the other area is the reduced labor cost investment, right? So you can have that person do something that's also useful, but because a lot of times they have skill sets that are that span a lot of areas, and so they can be doing things that are less painful and a little more useful probably in the eyes of the product people. So
good. So especially if you got a tool like BrowserUp that can help them automate or get rid of certain things they shouldn't be doing, essentially. Yeah. Because they can just outsource it to the tool and focus on the things where they can deliver more value with the tool rather than just reinvent the wheel, sort of.
Exactly.
What I'm hearing.
Exactly. Yeah.
That makes total sense. Eric, this was a really cool chat. I've learned certainly a few things about how you see the performance marketplace and how BrowserUp helps people, and it makes sense to me. So it's a tool that helps you reuse your current assets. If you get tests, you just use them and run them as performance tests, and the return on investment here is most of the practices it's kind of in line with our company, what we're doing here as well, actually, but pretty much all of the agile and DevOps movement subsidiaries, if you want to call them that, like performance testing, shift left performance, shift left anything really, etc., that they focus on, which is time to market and unrealized gains from the on the revenue side, plus actually cost saving on labor, etc. So that makes total sense to me. Thank you so much, Eric, for this chat. If people would like to reach out to you, how can they find you?
Yep. So you can reach me at ebeland@browserup.com. That's probably the best. So just drop me a line. I'm happy to chat. And yeah. So.
Awesome, man. Thanks a lot, and speak to you soon.
All right. Thank you. Have a great day.